Welcome, weary traveler. The night is cold, and the road behind you has been long. Come sit by the fire. The mountain wind howls outside these ancient walls, but here you are safe, for now. I am the keeper of this inn, and I have a story to tell you, a story whispered through generations, waiting for ears brave enough to hear it. Rue Barrée, Part 20 of 27, by Robert W. Chambers. The Luxembourg was a blaze of flowers. He walked slowly through the long avenues of trees, past mossy marbles and old-time columns, and threading the grove by the bronze lion came upon the tree-crowned terrace above the fountain. Below lay the basin shining in the sunlight. Flowering almonds encircled the terrace, and, in a greater spiral, groves of chestnuts wound in and out and down among the moist thickets by the western palace wing. At one end of the avenue of trees, the observatory rose, its white domes piled up like an eastern mosque. At the other end stood the heavy palace, with every window pane ablaze in the fierce sun of June. Around the fountain, children and white-capped nurses armed with bamboo poles were pushing toy boats whose sails hung limp in the sunshine. A dark policeman, wearing red epaulettes and a dress sword, watched them for a while and then went away to remonstrate with a young man who had unchained his dog. The dog was pleasantly occupied in rubbing grass and dirt into his back, while his legs waved into the air. The policeman pointed at the dog. He was speechless with indignation. "Well, Captain," smiled the young fellow. "Well, Monsieur Student," growled the policeman. "What do you come and complain to me for?" "If you don't chain him, I'll take him," shouted the policeman. "What's that to me, mon capitaine?" "What tea? Isn't that bulldog yours?" "If it was, don't you suppose I'd chain him?" The officer glared for a moment in silence, then, deciding that as he was a student, he was wicked, grabbed at the dog, who promptly dodged. Around and around the flower beds they raced, and when the officer came too near for comfort, the bulldog cut across a flower bed, which perhaps was not playing fair. The young man was amused, and the dog also seemed to enjoy the exercise. The policeman noticed this and decided to strike at the fountainhead of the evil. He stormed up to the student and said, "As the owner of this public nuisance, I arrest you." "But," objected the other, "I disclaim the dog." That was a poser. It was useless to attempt to catch the dog until 3 gardeners lent a hand, but then the dog simply ran away and disappeared in the Rue de Medici. The policeman shambled off to find consolation among the white-capped nurses, and the student, looking at his watch, stood up yawning. Then, catching sight of Hastings, he smiled and bowed. Hastings walked over to the marble, laughing. "Why, Clifford," he said, "I didn't recognize you." "It's my mustache," sighed the other. "I sacrificed it to humor a whim of a friend. What do you think of my dog?" "Then he is yours?" cried Hastings. "Of course. It's a pleasant change for him, this playing tag with policemen. But he is known now, and I'll have to stop it. He's gone home. He always does when the gardeners take a hand. It's a pity. He's fond of rolling on lawns." Then they chatted for a moment of Hastings, prospects, and Clifford politely offered to stand his sponsor at the studio. "You see, old Dr. Byram, told me about you before I met you," explained Clifford, "and Elliot and I will be glad to do anything we can." Then, looking at his watch again, he muttered, "I have just 10 minutes to catch the Versailles train, au revoir," and started to go, but catching sight of a girl advancing by the fountain, took off his hat with a confused smile. "Why are you not at Versailles?" she said, with an almost imperceptible acknowledgment of Hastings' presence. I'm going," murmured Clifford. For a moment they faced each other, and then Clifford, very red, stammered, "With your permission, I have the honor of presenting to you my friend, Monsieur Hastings." Hastings bowed low. She smiled very sweetly, but there was something of malice in the quiet inclination of her small Parisienne head. "I could have wished," she said, "that Monsieur Clifford might spare me more time when he brings with him so charming an American." Must I go, Valentine?" began Clifford. "Certainly," she replied. Clifford took his leave with very bad grace, wincing, when she added, "And give my dearest love to Cecile." As he disappeared in the Rue de Sceaux, the girl turned as if to go, but then suddenly remembering Hastings, looked at him and shook her head. "Monsieur Clifford is so perfectly harebrained," she smiled. "It is embarrassing sometimes. You have heard, of course, all about his success at the Salon?" He looked puzzled, and she noticed it. "You have been to the Salon, of course?" "Why, no," he answered. "I only arrived in Paris 3 days ago." She seemed to pay little heed to his explanation, but continued. "Nobody imagined he had the energy to do anything good, but on varnishing day the Salon was astonished by the entrance of Monsieur Clifford, who strolled about as bland as you please with an orchid in his buttonhole and a beautiful picture on the line." She smiled to herself at the reminiscence and looked at the fountain. "Monsieur Bouguereau told me that Monsieur Julien was so astonished that he only shook hands with Monsieur Clifford in a dazed manner, and actually forgot to pat him on the back. Fancy," she continued with much merriment, "fancy Papa Julien forgetting to pat one on the back." Hastings, wondering at her acquaintance with the great Bouguereau, looked at her with respect. "May I ask," he said diffidently, "whether you are a pupil of Bouguereau?" "I," she said in some surprise. Then she looked at him curiously. Was he permitting himself the liberty of joking on such short acquaintance? His pleasant, serious face questioned hers. "Tiens," she thought, "what a droll man. You surely study art?" he said. She leaned back on the crooked stick of her parasol and looked at him. "Why do you think so?" "Because you speak as if you did. You are making fun of me," she said, "and it is not good taste." She stopped, confused, as he colored to the roots of his hair. "How long have you been in Paris?" she said at length. 3 days, he replied gravely. But, surely you are not a nouveau. You speak French too well." Then, after a pause, "Really, are you a nouveau?" She sat down on the marble bench lately occupied by Clifford, and tilting her parasol over her small head, looked at him. "I don't believe it." He felt the compliment, and for a moment hesitated to declare himself one of the despised. Then, mustering up his courage, he told her how new and green he was, and all with a frankness which made her blue eyes open very wide and her lips part in the sweetest of smiles. "You have never seen a studio? How funny," she said solemnly. Then they both laughed. "And you," he said, "have seen studios? And you know Bouguereau?" "Yes, and Henner, and Constant, and Laurens, and Puvis de Chavannes, and Dagnan, and Courtois, and all the rest of them." "And yet you say you are not an artist." "Pardon," she said gravely. "Did I say I was not?" "Won't you tell me?" He hesitated. At first she looked at him, shaking her head and smiling. Then, of a sudden, her eyes fell, and she began tracing figures with her parasol in the gravel at her feet. Hastings had taken a place on the seat, and now, with his elbows on his knees, sat watching the spray drifting above the fountain jet. A small boy, dressed as a sailor, stood poking his yacht and crying, "I won't go home! I won't go home." His nurse raised her hands to heaven. "Just like a little American boy," thought Hastings, and a pang of homesickness shot through him. Presently the nurse captured the boat, and the small boy stood at bay. "Monsieur René, when you decide to come here, you may have your boat." The boy backed away, scowling. "Give me my boat, I say," he cried, "and don't call me René, for my name's Randall and you know it." "Hello," said Hastings. "Randall, that's English." "I am American," announced the boy in perfectly good English, turning to look at Hastings. "And she's such a fool she calls me René because Mama calls me Ranny." Here he dodged the exasperated nurse and took up his station behind Hastings, who laughed and, catching him around the waist, lifted him into his lap. "One of my countrymen," he said to the girl beside him. He smiled while he spoke, but there was a queer feeling in his throat. "Don't you see the stars and stripes on my yacht?" demanded Randall. Sure enough, the American colors hung limply under the nurse's arm. "Oh," cried the girl, "he is charming," and impulsively stooped to kiss him. But the infant Randall wriggled out of Hastings' arms, and his nurse pounced upon him with an angry glance at the girl. She reddened and then bit her lips as the nurse, with eyes still fixed on her, dragged the child away and ostentatiously wiped his lips with her handkerchief. Then she stole a look at Hastings and bit her lip again. "What an ill-tempered woman," he said. "In America, most nurses are flattered when people kiss their children." For an instant, she tipped the parasol to hide her face, then closed it with a snap and looked at him defiantly. "Do you think it strange that she objected?" "Why not?" he said in surprise. Again she looked at him with quick, searching eyes. His eyes were clear and bright, and he smiled back, repeating, "Why not?" "You are droll," she murmured, bending her head. But she made no answer, and sat silent, tracing curves and circles in the dust with her parasol. After a while he said, "I am glad to see that young people have so much liberty here. I understood that the French were not at all like us. You know, in America, or at least where I live in Millbrook, girls have every liberty, go out alone and receive their friends alone, and I was afraid I should miss it here. But I see how it is now, and I am glad I was mistaken." She raised her eyes to his and kept them there. He continued pleasantly, "Since I have sat here, I have seen a lot of pretty girls walking alone on the terrace there, and then you are alone too. Tell me, for I do not know French customs, do you have the liberty of going to the theater without a chaperone?" For a long time she studied his face, and then, with a trembling smile, said, "Why do you ask me?" "Because you must know, of course," he said gaily. "Yes," she replied indifferently, "I know." He waited for an answer, but getting none, decided that perhaps she had misunderstood him. "I hope you don't think I mean to presume on our short acquaintance," he began. "In fact, it is very odd, but I don't know your name. When Mr. Clifford presented me, he only mentioned mine. Is that the custom in France?" "It is the custom in the Latin Quarter," she said with a queer light in her eyes. Then suddenly she began talking almost feverishly. "You must know, Monsieur Hastings, that we are all un peu sans gêne here in the Latin Quarter. We are very bohemian, and etiquette and ceremony are out of place. It was for that Monsieur Clifford presented you to me with small ceremony, and left us together with less. Only for that, and I am his friend, and I have many friends in the Latin Quarter, and we all know each other very well. And I am not studying art, but what?" he said, bewildered. "I shall not tell you. It is a secret," she said with an uncertain smile. On both cheeks a pink spot was burning, and her eyes were very bright. Then, in a moment, her face fell. "Do you know Monsieur Clifford very intimately?" After a while she turned to him, grave and a little pale. My name is Valentine. Valentine Tissot. Might I ask a service of you on such very short acquaintance? Oh, he cried, I should be honored. It is only this, she said gently. It is not much. Promise me not to speak to Monsieur Clifford about me. Promise me that you will speak to no one about me. I promise, he said, greatly puzzled. She laughed nervously. I wish to remain a mystery. It is a caprice. But, he began, I had hoped that you might give Monsieur Clifford permission to present me at your house. My house, she repeated. I mean, where you live, in fact, to present me to your family. The change in the girl's face shocked him. I beg your pardon, he cried. I have hurt you. And as quick as a flash, she understood him, because she was a woman. My parents are dead, she said. Presently he began again, very gently. Would it displease you if I beg you to receive me? It is the custom. I cannot, she answered. Then, glancing up at him, I am sorry. I should like to, but believe me, I cannot. He bowed seriously and looked vaguely uneasy. It isn't because I don't wish to. I like you. You are very kind to me. Kind? He cried, surprised and puzzled. I like you, she said slowly, and we will see each other sometimes if you will. At friends' houses. No, not at friends' houses. Here, she said with defiant eyes. Why, he cried, in Paris you are much more liberal in your views than we are. She looked at him curiously. Yes, we are very bohemian. I think it is charming, he declared. You see, we shall be in the best of society, she ventured timidly, with a pretty gesture toward the statues of the dead queens, ranged in stately ranks above the terrace. He looked at her, delighted, and she brightened at the success of her innocent little pleasantry. Indeed, she smiled, I shall be well chaperoned, because you see, we are under the protection of the gods themselves. Look, there are Apollo and Juno and Venus on their pedestals, counting them on her small gloved fingers, and Ceres, Hercules, but I can't make out. Hastings turned to look up at the winged god under whose shadow they were seated. Why, it's love, he said.